Okay, good morning, everybody. So we begin. I hope that everybody is doing fine and that you are not terribly depressed with being locked up in one place for a long period of time. So hopefully this extraordinary situation will be end soon and we will go back to our normal lives by and large. Uh, Today we begin with our chapter 16, which deals with the problem of expectations in macroeconomic theory. How psychological attitudes and how the way people manage and create and manage their expectations about the future influence the macroeconomic analysis in general. And there is a wide variety of theoretical models that deal with this. There is a wide variety of different views about how expectations shape macroeconomic results or macroeconomic outcomes. So we've seen thus far that a large chunk of what macroeconomics and macroeconomists do has to do with collecting the data and studying different statistical and empirical variables, employment, unemployment, inflation, total spending, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and so on. And we'll see that a large part of macroeconomic theorizing has to do with comparing and matching and trying to theoretically explain the relationship between these aggregates. That's something that I warned you about at the very beginning, that this is a very specific economics discipline, the macroeconomic theory, that a large part of what it does is trying to discern certain statistical or empirical relationships between the things that we can measure in the economy. So it pretends to be scientific insofar as it wants to be objective and based on observations and objective data rather than on abstract theorizing. And especially it wants to avoid, if humanly possible at all, anything that reeks of subjectivism and psychology. So it doesn't want to deal with human person, with human individuality, with human expectations. Now the irony of the situation that it cannot avoid it. And we will see in this chapter how after 20 or 30 years of heroic attempts to completely avoid analyzing human mind and human expectations and human psychology, macroeconomists eventually had to settle for a simple proposition that should have been obvious from the get-go, that you cannot account for these abstract relationships between inflation, unemployment, public debt, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and so on, that you cannot account for them without spelling out certain assumptions or certain heuristic view, at least, about how human psychology works and how people relate to what's going on in an economy. So that's one point that I wanted to drive home at the very beginning here, that this chapter shows very nicely this internal tension within macroeconomics. On the one hand, we want to be as objective as possible, we want to be as empirical as possible, we want to minimize the influence of anything subjective and psychological to the utmost degree. We want to deal only with the measurable, with the objectively ascertainable data, to be data driven, to be scientific. And on the other hand, we cannot help but making certain subjective assumptions about what people do, how people behave, how people construct the expectations, and so on, which are by their very nature subjective and could not be checked in the same way that the statistical relationships between different magnitudes could be checked empirically and measured objectively. So that's one internal that this chapter very nicely illustrates this conflict, and it shows that the incompleteness of any macroeconomic theory that would try to do away completely altogether with anything subjective and anything psychological. So we will begin. There are 4 or 5 different topics and subtopics of this chapter, as you see from this list. Today we're gonna analyze one topic which is divided up into 2 sections here. The first one is the so-called Phillips curve. We'll see what is that. One curve depicting a particular type of statistical relationship between 2 macroeconomic aggregates, namely inflation and unemployment, and deriving certain far-reaching public policy conclusions from this statistical analysis, objective, historically attested, empirical correlation depicted in the Phillips curve. And then we will see how the controversy about the Phillips curve was one of the first seminal points in modern macroeconomics, because it has demonstrated that you cannot make sense of the Phillips curve until and unless you make certain controversial assumptions about how people form expectations. In other words, if you don't inject certain element of subjective assumptions into your own theory, the Phillips curve analysis doesn't make much sense. And some further development of this theory, the expectations theory that emerged out of the Phillips curve controversy, branched into 2 or 3 different additional theories that had some additional different and more complex and more complicated views about how expectations exactly shape macroeconomic outcomes. Okay, but today just the Phillips curve analysis, and then Milton Friedman's monetarist critique of the Phillips curve based on his view of expectations in macroeconomic theory. So what is a Phillips curve? So Phillips curve is one mathematical tool, one hypothesized mathematical function based on an empirical analysis that British economist Phillips constructed in 1950s. And what he studied was the relationship between the increase in nominal wages, on the one hand, so nominal wages, what was called the wage inflation, increase in the nominal amount of wages that people earn, and the unemployment rate. So he just studied, there was nothing particularly fancy or complicated about this. The guy was just a statistician who studied the time series of data in England from early 20th century until 1950s, and he matched the annual numbers, the annual figures of, on the one hand, the unemployment data, percentage of unemployed people, and on the other hand, the increase in wage rates, what he called the wage inflation. And he wondered if he plots together the points that match the unemployment rates and the wage rates, that he would discover some kind of meaningful relationship between these 2 variables. And what he discovered was very, very interesting. This plotting of changes in money wages against the unemployment rates. In the exhibit 1, here you have these black dots. These are the plots of the annual unemployment rates and the rate of change, rate of increase or decrease of the wage rates. And what he discovered actually that in principle, so data covered the period from 1861 to 1913. And he published this in 1957, I think, and even the further data after 1913 essentially confirmed this relationship. What it had shown actually that there is an inverse relationship between the rate of increase in money wages That's the vertical axis over here, and the unemployment rate. So which means just like a demand curve, this similar shape, as the money wage rate increases more, the unemployment rate tends to go down. So this was very important for Great Britain in 1950s because they wanted to study, this was primarily the study of the labor market. So what happens on the labor market with regard to the demands for higher wages by the trade unions. So Great Britain was one of the countries with very strong trade unions after the Second World War, especially the private sector trade unions, and they will retain their extraordinary social and economic power until 1980s when Margaret Thatcher dismantled that power. So he studied the labor market, and the question was, can we have a relatively low rate of unemployment with a higher rate of wage increases? So that's whether the trade unions demands for higher and higher wages could be consistent with low unemployment rates. And the answer was yes. Higher money wages meant the lower unemployment rate. Obviously, as in most cases, in most countries, you see that almost all years were grouped around this downward sloping red line that connected them into one nice curve, which was called Phillips curve, according to economist A.W. Phillips. So that was the origin of the Phillips curve analysis. It was just a statistical exercise. The guy collected the data and draw a curve through the data. It had shown that statistically he didn't hypothesize any causal explanation what it is that actually creates this statistical relationship here. How exactly increased money wages would cause the lower unemployment rate. Or maybe the lower unemployment rate causes higher money wages, or some combination of the two. He didn't hypothesize the causal explanation of this relationship at all, but, but just plotted the data and had shown, comrades, this seems to be the case. This seems to be the statistical relationship. Whatever causes what, this is how things look out there in reality. The conclusion that most people derived at that time in Great Britain is actually that labor market can tolerate a greater influence of labor union and higher money wages that labor unions usually successfully secure for their members, and that the unemployment rate will be even lower. So that was the origin of the original Phillips curve. One conclusion was the trade unions, and another conclusion as well was that if you want to reduce wage inflation, or a very strong reason why inflation increases is that wage rates increase too excessively. So sometimes the trade unions were accused of being the cause of inflation. So then the policy prescription was, if you want to keep the inflation rate, general inflation under control, you will have to reduce the rate of increase in nominal wages. You have to rein in the power of trade unions to uncontrollably increase wages year after year. So the meaning and the main message of the Phillips curve was not so fast. If you try to reduce the rate of increase in money wages, what's going to happen? You're going to increase unemployment. So that's the policymakers in Britain and elsewhere in Europe and in America concluded that it was very difficult to to use the wage policy, trade union policy, to reduce the money wages, because the direct consequence of that will be that unemployment will increase. You will have a recession if you try to rein in the trade union practices of increasing money wages. So that was a very good conclusion for the trade unionism, and a very bad conclusion for the free market. So this was the original British version of the curve. In America, they tried to make the analysis more exact, more strict. So two economists who were later going to get the Nobel Prize in economics, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow. So they generalized this analysis, and they asked a simple question: what if we plot, instead of rate of change in money wages on the vertical axis over here against the unemployment rate, what if we plot consumer price index, the general price level, changes in the general price level against the unemployment rate? Would we get the same curve as Phillips got for money wages versus unemployment in Great Britain? That's what they did. And here is what I got. Essentially, a confirmation, a thoroughgoing confirmation of the Phillips original analysis. This was the Americanized Phillips curve. So the only difference between Samuelson's Solow Phillips curve and a Phillips curve was that on the vertical axis we had now a strict measure of inflation rate, change in the CPI, change in the consumer price index, the standard measure of inflation, and on the horizontal axis, unemployment rate. So they use the data in order to come up with this relationship. They use the statistical data from the United States economy this time around, not from British economy, period 1935 to 1959. So they measured price inflation every year, and they measured unemployment rate, and they just plotted the data in the same coordinating system over here, and they found the same graph, the same downward sloping line, and the same trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So what this had shown was that in an economy, in a macroeconomy, objectively speaking, statistically speaking, looking at the data, there seems to be a trade-off between inflation rate and unemployment rate, which means that in general you can have either a relatively high inflation rate, point D on this graph here, and a relatively low unemployment rate, or you can have very low inflation and a relatively high unemployment rate as at point A here, or some combination or some middle ground between the two. In the case B, you will have a slightly higher inflation but slightly lower unemployment rate, or C, you will have a yet slightly more higher inflation rate and slightly lower unemployment rate. So there seems to be this statistical correlation had suggested that there seems to have been, at least in this 25-year period, direct and very strong correlation between the inflation rate, negative correlation between the inflation rate and unemployment rate. So this meant you can guess now. It's not a rocket science to guess what is the policy conclusion derived from this. The policy conclusion here is if you want to avoid recession, you have to settle for higher inflation rate. Inflation is a lesser evil. So you want stable prices or low rate of price increase, you can have it, no problem, but the price that you're going to pay for that is a very high unemployment rate. So this was the standard common wisdom in the Keynesian economics in 1950s, 1960s, all the way to mid 1970s. So this idea that you have a menu of choices here, how you can want to manage the macroeconomy, and the main choice that you're facing, which means a very low unemployment rate, you will have to settle for a significant inflation. And then the final, no, not the final, but the further implication of this was that you cannot have a non-inflationary economic growth. That's one weird conclusion from this analysis that no economist before Keynes would have ever thought of. Because in America, remember one point that I always like to repeat, that in the late 19th century, America has had a very high rate of real economic growth. An increase in productivity and real GDP and wages was very high, unemployment rate very low, and yet the general price level was going down. And now the Keynesians so completely revised the common wisdom about the macroeconomics that they believed now that you cannot have a non-inflationary economic growth. You cannot have a non-inflationary full employment of resources. Because the Phillips curve shows actually what happens, what it takes to have a full employment. It takes high rate of inflation. If you bring down the inflation rate, if you keep inflation under control, you will have a high unemployment rate, which means inefficiency, which means recession, which means less than 100% use of resources. So you see, this Phillips curve is just a different graphical depiction of the aggregate supply curve. So let me show you that. This curve here, aggregate supply curve. The only difference is that on the vertical axis with aggregate supply curve, you have a quantity of goods and services being produced on the horizontal axis. So more goods and services you produce, higher the rate of utilization of your resources is. So here, for example, let me see. So low unemployment rate corresponds to high GDP production. If you imagine that, following my cursor here, that this would be the aggregate supply curve, the unit on the horizontal axis would change. It wouldn't be the unemployment rate anymore. It would have been the real GDP. So then the relationship will be the same. Higher the inflation rate, higher the real GDP would be. So then you can have a higher economic growth, but the price that you have to pay for that is higher inflation rate. So you remember that the short run aggregate supply curve. It's the same thing as the Phillips curve. The only difference is that Phillips curve expresses the degree of efficiency and degree of productivity of your economy not through the aggregate production figures, real GDP on the horizontal axis, but rather unemployment rate. So more efficient you are, closer to zero on the horizontal axis you are, lower the unemployment rate. So again, the same relationship. More efficient, more successful the economy is, lower the unemployment rate is, higher the inflation rate is. So in both cases, you have the same statistical relationship between productivity and inflation. Greater productivity of an economy, a greater rate of economic growth in the long term requires higher inflation rate. There is no non-inflationary economic growth. In this particular case of the Phillips curve, there is no non-inflationary or low inflation full employment economy. So this was the main analytical tool that had been used for close to 30 years after the Second World War. and it seemed to have worked very well until 1970s. So the macroeconomists were always worrying whether the economy is overheating, which means that inflation is growing too high, then you would want to bring it down a little bit, to use monetary or fiscal policy to reduce inflation a little bit. You would know that unemployment will increase slightly, but you have to sacrifice something. You would always balancing the benefits of inflationary growth against the costs of deflationary recession. If you wanna increase your economic growth, you can have it, but you will have to endure a higher inflation rate. Or if you want to keep inflation under control, you will have to increase the unemployment rate. You have to go from D to C. Then, yeah, you will have lower inflation, but you will have higher unemployment. So this was called the fine-tuning of the economy. So this fiddling with the numbers. Actually, economists were most of what macroeconomists were doing were still looking at the time series of numbers and comparing one quarter of economic statistics to another, and then saying whether we should increase money supply 5% or government spending 2.3% in order to bring down inflation rate 0.7% in order how many people will get unemployed, maybe 0.35% and so on. So these were the preoccupations of economists for some decades in the mid 20th century, but the basic framework was unquestionable. This was the main tool. This was what everybody believed. This was what everybody believed. Go up, and in the same time unemployment would go up. So that was considered to be unimaginable. One of the he was chief economic advisor in the Eisenhower administration, and a thoroughgoing Keynesian and thoroughgoing practitioner of this kind of economic theory. And they were discussing the Phillips curve and discussing the inflation unemployment trade-off. And Rothbard, who was freezes in a recession, unemployment goes up, and instead of inflation rate going down, inflation starts increasing. Going to resign then. That would be the only solution here, because we wouldn't have known what to do, because that's considered to be impossible. And sure enough, what was impossible and a subject matter of joking promises to resign started happening in 1970s. Started happening in 1970s. Let me show you. So this is the picture of the more up-to-date statistical data time series from 1961 to 2003. The same relationship between on the vertical axis inflation rate and on the horizontal axis unemployment rate. So you see the shaded area is the period between 1935 until 1960 something, and it largely corresponds to the expectations from the Phillips curve analysis, that you will have downward sloping curve connecting different points in the time series, showing the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. But you have plenty of years and plenty of periods in which you have like this upward sloping Phillips curve that shows higher inflation rate, higher unemployment rate. So this phenomenon was called, that got going in the 1970s and throughout 1980s, was called stagflation. So stagflation. So stagflation is the simultaneous appearance of increased inflation on the one hand and increased unemployment at the same time. So this was something that the Keynesian economic theory didn't know how to explain. So this was the beginning of the controversy, because in some years the statistical relationship hypothesized by the Phillips curve the inverse statistical relationship between inflation and unemployment in this shaded area hold or held. In some years, it didn't hold at all. So how to explain this? How to explain this phenomenon that economy, instead of growing, before we couldn't have imagined a non-inflationary economic growth. Now we have inflationary recessions, which should have been impossible according to the Keynesian theory, according to Phillips curve analysis. So now one of the you see, there is one philosopher of science called Thomas Kuhn, and he says that it's very naive to think about progress of science as just accumulation of knowledge that advances and progresses year after year, month after month, decade after decade. That whoever comes after the previous guy will just refine the analysis, improve it, tweak it in order to fit the data better, and then the knowledge just grows gradually over time and improves. That's a naive, sometimes called the vague history of science, this optimistic view that science progresses linearly and that there are no gaps, there are no big revolutions, there are no losses of knowledge. Science just advances. Thomas Kuhn believes that this is not the way how science advances. This is not the way how science changes. The science changes through the paradigm shifts, changes in paradigms. And why paradigms? How this works? You have one paradigm, like this Phillips curve Keynesian analysis is the prevailing conceptual framework within which economists used to think about the macroeconomic policy for close to 30 years, because that was their best data and best analysis that they had at that time, fitting very nicely their ideological and political preconceptions. So that was the paradigm within which they were operating. And slowly but surely, some new data appeared that questioned this paradigm. For a while, the economists would try to tweak the analysis, would try to make the inconvenient data go away, to ignore them, or to explain them as just as a limited special case, and so on and so forth. So they would try to preserve their paradigm within which they think and on which they base their analysis, while explaining away, in a certain sense, the anomalous data that do not fit the paradigm. But after a while, after a sufficient accumulation of adverse empirical evidence, the paradigm has to shift. Eventually, when this burden of adverse contradictory evidence accumulates enough, then the paradigm has to be abandoned. And that's how science revolutions happens, when the existing paradigms are not consistent anymore at all with the evidence. Something else, something new, something different has to be invented in order to better explain the data. So it's not just a linear advance, just the linear improvements, gradual improvements over what people knew before. Sometimes it's just an abrupt abandonment of the previous paradigm and coming up with something completely different. So this is what happened by and large here, and this breaking point of the Keynesian paradigm was the phenomenon of stagflation. So if there was one thing that was deemed absolutely impossible and inexcusable in this model, was that the simultaneous appearance of high inflation rate and high unemployment rate. And that's exactly what happened in the most obvious, undeniable, and painful fashion in 1970s in America, in Europe, that you had high inflation rates, double-digit inflation. So the generation of your parents or grandparents will remember this under Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter from 1973, 1977, 78. You had double-digit inflation in America, something which is absolutely unimaginable nowadays. 10, 11, 13, 14% inflation rate. It's a very high inflation rate. And in the same time, you had recession after recession and essentially zero economic growth. That's the reason why the entire period was called the stagflation, this phenomenon of economic stagnation, sharp recessions followed by anemic recoveries, and then once again recession, and once again anemic recovery. So you had, in essence, a zero economic growth or very low economic growth, accompanied by a very high inflation rate. That's stagflation. So Keynesians and people who base their analysis on the Phillips curve didn't know how to explain this, couldn't explain this at all. So this is where Milton Friedman, with his analysis, came in. He was later going to get the Nobel Prize in economics for a variety of things. This was one of the theoretical innovations that he offered. The explanation for this phenomenon of stagflation. What he said essentially was that you cannot do, you cannot create economic prosperity in the long run by higher inflation rate. That this seeming relationship, this seeming statistical correlation between high inflation and low unemployment is a mirage, is a short-term phenomenon. That in the long run, the unemployment rate is fixed. There is something called the natural rate of unemployment in theory, and this natural rate of unemployment is determined by the real factors such as technological productivity, the level of education, the level of taxes, the population size. So non-monetary, non-policy factors in the long run determine how much the economy could produce and what is going to be the rate of unemployment at this full capacity of production of an economy. So this natural rate of unemployment corresponds to this long run aggregate supply curve that you will remember we talked about. This green line in window window 1, 2, and 3, this vertical green line is called long run aggregate supply curve. So the natural unemployment rate would be the unemployment rate that will exist if the economy is fixed. It cannot be increased by 100%. This is the unemployment rate. In the short run, however, you can fiddle around with the numbers. In the short run, you can make a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. You can increase the money supply, you can increase through fiscal policy the total amount of spending, but in the long run, you cannot do it. So Friedman did two things. He explained how stagflation came about by saying stagflation is a consequence of the fact that you cannot buy in the long run the higher rates of economic growth and consequently lower rates of unemployment by higher inflation. You can do it only in the short run. And number two, he offered an explanation why is that so, and the explanation is based on expectations. So this is the first point when the expectations in economic theory enter the point. Milton Friedman's theory of, as we will see in a second, so-called adaptive expectations, expectations that people in which people adapt to the changed circumstances in the economy. So the sequence of events, what happens if you want to try, let's say, to use the Keynesian policies to increase the aggregate demand in the hope that you're going to reduce the unemployment rate? So what happens according to Milton Friedman? So here is the long run Phillips curve. So Phillips curve in the long run is vertical, which means that you cannot change it by inflation. Phillips curve is the same thing as the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay? That's the same thing. The only difference is that with the long run aggregate supply curve on the horizontal axis, you don't have the real GDP, you have the unemployment rate. So unemployment in the long run is what it is based on technological, political, economic, legal, regulatory framework of the economy. You cannot change it in the long run by your macroeconomic policy. However, in the short run, you can have different Phillips curves, and they're downward sloping, reflecting the short-term trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So let's say this point one that you have here, this is you are in the macroeconomic equilibrium, and window one shows exactly what is this macroeconomic equilibrium. It's a long run equilibrium, actually. You will see that the short run aggregate supply curve is in equilibrium with the long run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve. So that's point one. Now, what you want to do here, you want to move along the Phillips curve, along the first long run Phillips curve from point one to point two. Okay? So you want to move from point one to point two, which means that you want to have lower unemployment rate and higher inflation rate. So you're not satisfied with this here. You want more. You believe that you can move this vertical line to the right. So you want to move to the right here to increase your real GDP by increasing the aggregate demand. And you do it on the Phillips curve. This is shown in the short run. You decrease the unemployment rate. In window two, it is shown what happens. The aggregate demand curve moves to so in window one, window two, and window three is the regular aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. So don't get confused with that. In the big image here is the Phillips curve. On the horizontal axis is unemployment rate. Okay. In these small windows, the horizontal axis is real GDP or production. So here window two shows what happens when you move from point one to point two alongside the Phillips curve. So eventually the short-term result is that you will have lower unemployment rate and you will have slightly higher inflation rate. This is shown in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework as a move of the aggregate demand curve to the right. So point two here is this new short-term equilibrium, which has higher inflation rate and higher real GDP. So that's the exact same thing as here, just differently expressed. Here in the Phillips curve framework, you have a higher inflation rate and lower unemployment rate. In the aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve framework, you have higher inflation rate and higher real GDP. So higher real GDP essentially means lower unemployment. That's the same thing. Of course, if you produce more, you will use your resources to a higher degree. There will be less people who are unemployed. Now the crucial step now is step point three, that you're gonna end up eventually in number three here with an even higher inflation rate than in point two, but with a higher unemployment. So this is a stagflationary move. This is what causes stagflation, according to Milton Friedman. So what's going to happen here? So what's going to happen here is that as you increase the aggregate demand, you increase the price level in the economy. As you increase the price level, all prices will start to increase, but alongside all prices, the wage rates will increase. So people will realize that, or form the expectations about the future prices by looking back and seeing that the prices of other goods and services started to increase. So they will then make a quick calculation that in order to protect their standard of living, the workers will negotiate for higher wages. So then the employers will have to pay higher wages in order to remain competitive in the business. So people will not work for lower wages. Wage rates will have to go up. If wage rates go up, that makes the productivity of the economy is the wage rates, the wages or labor costs are the major category of costs. All other things being equal, higher labor costs will lead to lower productivity. So lower productivity will mean that smaller quantity of goods and services will be produced, and this will be shown in this aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework. That's something we covered last week. You can revisit that. The short run aggregate supply curve will move to the left. So you will end up in point 3. The point 3 in the big picture here and in the window 3 are the same pictures. You will have higher inflation rate and lower real GDP from this point to this point here. Aggregate supply curve shifts. So you have higher inflation and you have lower production, which means here the same movement from 2 to 3. You have higher inflation rate and you have higher unemployment rate in the same time. So that's the explanation that Friedman gives for what's happening, and this window 3, this process in the ADAC framework in the window 3 is the key. The explanation for why this happens is the key. The explanation is simply because inflationary expectations by the people will make them bargain for higher wages, and this bargaining for higher wages will create pressure to reduce production and to reduce aggregate supply, which will lead then to a drop in GDP, to a recession, and which will lead to higher prices in the same time. So here is the depiction of the mechanics of Friedman's theory of natural rate of unemployment. So this vertical line here, long run aggregate supply curve in ADAC, aggregate demand, aggregate supply framework, is essentially the same as this long run Phillips curve. And both of them say that the economy in the long run, you cannot rely on tricks like inflation or fiscal stimulus or monetary stimulus. In the long run, you have to settle for what your economy can produce based on real factors, on real stuff. So there is something called natural rate of unemployment and natural rate of production. And Friedman would variously say that it's either a level of productivity that the economy can deliver at zero inflation, or with constant rate of inflation, constant low rate of inflation over time. Usually that's the institutional extension of what he means actually by natural rate of unemployment. So here you have this idea, you're not happy with point 1, which is the only thing that you can have. That's the maximum productivity that your size of your population allows you to have. Then the productive capacity of your economy allows you to have in the long run, that the tax and regulatory system and capital markets allow you to have in the long run. You cannot have more. Sorry, it would have been nice if you could have produced more in the long run, but you cannot do it. However, if you want to make an increase, you can do it by printing money or by increasing the aggregate demand in some fashion, and you're going to move to point 2, from point 1 to point 2. If there are no change in expected inflation rate, if you can fool everybody forever, including workers, to expect zero inflation rate, irrespective of the fact that inflation rate has increased by 2 or 3% between point 1 and point 2. You can just keep going forever, increasing production while increasing inflation. So that's this image 1 is if there are no change in expected inflation rate. So people will accept to work for the same nominal wages, although the prices of everything else will keep increasing. If you can do that, you can increase production more and more, essentially by exploiting labor, by forcing workers to accept lower wages, by imposing taxes of 5, 10, 15, 20% on labor per year. However, since we live in a free society in which you cannot force people to do that, people will adjust over time their expectations. If they saw inflation rate 2% last year, they will now expect that. That's the essence of Friedman's adaptive expectations theory. Adaptive expectations means that people change their behavior according to changed expectations of what's going to happen in the future, but the basis for their changes is the past. People extrapolate from the past. If they've seen 2% inflation rate in 2019, they're likely to ask for 2% increase in wage rates in 2020. Okay, so these are adaptive expectations. So people seeing something happening in the near past, they're now going to assume that something similar is going to happen in the near future. So they adapt. They're not proactive, they're reactive, they adapt to what they've seen in the past. So that's the reason why, according to Friedman, you can have short-term gains, you can trick, you can fool people in the short term because people's expectations are mostly adaptive. They look at the past and see what happened in the past, and they change their behavior by asking for example, 2% higher wages if they've seen inflation rate 2% in the previous year. So that's why you cannot, if in 2019 you increased GDP at the price of 2% inflation rate, let's say between 0.1 and 0.2 here. In 2020, people will ask for 2% increase in wage rates. So essentially, you will have to go down. Then 2% increase in wage rates will lead to 2% decrease in sometimes 3%, sometimes 1%, but significant decrease in the aggregate supply, in productivity, because you have to pay now more money to labor, to workers, and your aggregate supply curve will shift to the left, and you will be going back to the long run average. The only way to avoid this would be just to keep increasing money prices year after year. So you increase it 2% in 2019, and now you know that people will ask for 2% increased wage rate. So now you increase prices, you increase the money supply even more, and then you have inflation 4% or 5%. So the only way to get out of the bind here, the only way to keep swindling people, workers, is to just progressively year after year increase inflation more and more and more and more. And eventually the hyperinflation, very high rate of inflation, is the only way that you can maintain this entire scam for very long, according to Friedman. But that's the breakdown of the economic system. The only way that you can, in the long run, change anything is actually, or shift the long run aggregate supply curve, is to shift it to the left by essentially destroying economy by inflation. So that's the reason why Friedman believes that you cannot, there is a certain natural bound, natural limit to how much you can do through monetary policy and fiscal policy, and it is determined by the real productivity of your economy. And the reason why you cannot go beyond that point is that people change their expectations based on previous experience. And these adaptive expectations will lead to a situation in which your initial increase in productivity created by inflation will be matched and counteracted by an increased demand for wages, which will lead to even higher prices and to the lower level of productivity. Okay, we will see next time that there are different theories about the expectations that look differently in that look differently at the way of how people form expectations, that define the nature of human expectations in a different way. For example, rational expectations, you'll see that they argue that um, people are much more rational, that they're actually proactive, that they're better in predicting what's going to happen in the future, that their behavior today is not influenced just by what they've seen before and they just extrapolate the previous experience to the future, which is not very efficient. It allows certain short-term maneuvering space to monetary authorities. Rational expectations theory says, no, people also use the best available information right now to predict what's going to happen in the future independent of the past. If this is the case, you'll see that one student of Milton Friedman's, Robert Lucas, got the Nobel Prize for this particular theory. Then the scope of monetary and fiscal policy is extremely narrow. If people can form by and large correct expectations about the future inflation rate, then no macroeconomic policy could be efficient whatsoever. People will adjust proactively to everything that you want to do, and then there will be no move. There will be no move even in the short run. Monetary and fiscal policy couldn't work. But more about that next time. This is all I've got for today as a way of introduction to the role of expectations in macroeconomic policy. Next time around, we will discuss these rational expectation schools and new Keynesians, how the new generation of Keynesians who were defeated in 1970s, that is, their Phillips curve was discredited completely, how in 1980s and especially in the 1990s and onwards, a new generation of Keynesians who wanted to retain the Keynesian model of macroeconomics tried to create a new hybrid model that would take into account the criticism of Friedmanite and George Lucas's criticism of the Phillips curve, while retaining the basic Keynesian assumptions about macroeconomic theory. So that would be the two main topics for the next lecture on Wednesday: the rational expectations school and the new Keynesians, what they believe, and maybe a few final concluding points about the real business cycle theory. But that would be the minor one. The two main problems would be rational expectations and the new Keynesian theory. Okay, so that's everything for today. Stay healthy and stay in good spirits, and I'll see you all in virtual space on Wednesday. Please, the deadline for the old homework assignment is today, tonight. You have enough time. You have enough time to finish that. On Canvas, if you have any questions about this lecture or about chapter 16, please don't hesitate to ask them. I'm ready to create another video at the end of this week. So these online lectures, we'll have two lectures on Monday and Wednesday, and I will then, if you ask questions or have any comments about them, I will create an additional video at the end of the week trying to answer those questions and comments. Okay, bye bye.